855-592-0013.
Broadcasting from the Paddock Mall Studios, this is WOCA, Ocala, Gainesville, The Villages, 1370 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.
All right, 6 minutes after 10 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in. We talk about the changes that we've seen, and usually we refer to technology. But the truth is, some of the more important changes that have happened have been social changes. When you just think about, when we always say the good old days, think about how women were treated, think about how black people were treated, right?
Yeah.
And you don't need me to tell you, especially if you are a black person, especially if you've been around for a while. I mean, if you're young, then you were born into a much better world than your mom and your grandma were born into.
Mm-hmm.
But we've come a long way, and maybe we still got a long way to go. But when you hear some of the stories from the past that really underscore the unfairness that the black community had to put up with, it does definitely makes you think. And if you're a sports fan, you're going to love this story for that as well. Michael Kranish is on the phone. He's an investigative reporter, a contributor to the Washington Post, the Miami Herald, the Boston Globe, and his book is called The World's Fastest Man, The Extraordinary Life of Cyclist Major Taylor, America's first black sports hero. I never heard this one before, never heard the name before. And that's why I love when we talk to some of the authors who've done this kind of work. Michael, good morning. Thank you. It's an honor to have you on our show.
Thanks for having me.
Where are you? Where are you calling from?
I'm in the newsroom of the Washington Post, where I work.
All right. Well, thank you for calling in to tell us about this. So tell us your story about finding this, about Major Taylor. How did you learn about him?
Well, about 2 decades ago, I was working at the Boston Globe. There's an echo on the line, unfortunately. I hope that's not disturbing the listeners.
Did that help?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
No, I still hear it, but okay, we'll go ahead.
Really?
Yeah. Anyway, I was at the Boston Globe, and I was learning about Major Taylor because he lived in Worcester, Massachusetts, not too far from Boston. So I had the chance to meet his then 96-year-old daughter, and reading a lot of things from the time, listening to her, the bottom line was I learned the story of this athlete who in the 1890s became the first black sports hero, champion, whatever word you want to use, in a sport that people don't really think about today, but it was cycling. It was the most popular sport at the time, cycling around a track. This was in the days of the horse and buggy, and tens of thousands of people would come out to velodromes, as they were called, to see the cyclists go around the track. The whites raced on their tracks, basically. Blacks, raced their races. But Major Taylor came along in the 1890s, and he said, no, I want to race against the best white racers in the world, and that's exactly what he did.
Oh, wow. And knowing that would have some pushback against him, obviously.
Right. Well, he had grown up in Indianapolis, Indiana. He experienced racism. He wasn't allowed even to go to the YMCA, for example. There was a mentor there who ran a bicycle company who then decided he would take Major Taylor to Massachusetts, a more liberal state, and trained him. And in the 1890s, took Major Taylor to New York City and entered him in a race in Madison Square Garden, where he was able to face the best racers in the world. In that race, he won a sprint match against the best sprinters, and then he did what was called a 6-day race, which, as it sounds, you went around the track for 6 days, took an hour off here or there, and whoever had the most laps at the end of 6 days won.
Whoa.
So a lot of people,
oh my gosh.
incredible. It was considered inhumane. People said it took years off your life to do. It really, later that kind of racing was banned. It was so dangerous. But Major Taylor, at 18 years old, was able to remain in the race. A lot of racers would drop out as that kind of competition. And he came in 8th place, but to do it, he had to go 1,700 miles. So that was an extraordinary accomplishment, and he became an international sensation because this was against the best riders in the world. And if you could just picture a time when there were a couple hundred cars in the country, and those were really experiments. They didn't go backwards. They didn't have brakes, typically. You had about 5 million bicycles. This was the height of what was known as the bicycle craze. And for a lot of people, this was revolutionary. This was the future. And as I said earlier, this was the most popular sport in the country at the time, more so than baseball. So for a brief moment in time, and to put it in perspective, you have to remember that 1896 was the year that the Supreme Court ruled in the infamous case of Plessy versus Ferguson that accommodations for black would be okay if they were separate but equal. Of course, that wasn't fair to blacks, but that basically institutionalized the Jim Crow laws that spread so widely. So he came on at that race in Madison Square Garden 7 months after the Supreme Court decision. So he wanted to not just win a race, but disprove the racist theories of the time that had led to those kind of decisions.
And did he see it? Well, not in his lifetime, I'm guessing, because I mean we had separation of the races here in this part of Florida. Oh my gosh! I think as recent as the early '70s.
Yeah.
Some of the people who have lived here all these years have told me that. Yeah.
I'll tell you, since you're in Ocala, my first job in journalism 40 years ago, if I can date myself, was in Lakeland, same newspaper chain that owned the Ocala newspaper at the time. It was New York Times owned the chain of papers in Florida. That was 1979. I'd come down, I grew up in the D.C. area, and one of the first assignments they gave me was to cover the Klan March around Lake Mirror in Lakeland.
Oh, my gosh. Oh, wow.
That was only 40 years ago.
Yeah, really.
Very much in my lifetime. One of the things I remembered. Now, there weren't a whole lot of people turning out. It was sort of a joke when in the end I went to see, and, I remember very well there was a black resident of Lakeland who took his kid there and said, I just want you to see, essentially, what race had to put up with. No one was taking it very seriously. Basically, these people were trying to get publicity, but it was a very, serious issue. Major Taylor, in fact, wanted to train in Florida during the winter.
Really?
So he planned to do that near St. Petersburg, where there were a lot of people competing up north in the summer, but they'd come to Florida, just like the baseball teams, to train in Florida, and he was not allowed to do that. And in the end, he had to go to Savannah, and the racism there was so bad he had to leave Savannah as well. So that's the one, Florida aspect of the story. He certainly, knew that there was some severe separation in Florida.
So I'm going to ask kind of a speculative, psychological kind of a question, but do you think that his desire to not only be fast, but also to prove all the racist theories wrong was like a double dose of what's the word I'm looking for, Robin? When you're motivated, motivation. Do you think both of those things help motivate him?
Yeah, I say very strongly that this wasn't just for his personal glory, but he had to succeed because he had the greater purpose of disproving these racist theories. At the time, there were so-called scientists who put forward racist theories of eugenics that basically said blacks were mentally and physically inferior. Yeah, I mean, this was very common at the time, and it was used by whites to rationalize their racist behavior. Major Taylor comes along, and he is disproving this race after race. He's an incredible competitor, and a lot of the white racers eventually realized how good he was, and they tried to ban him. They would cite Jim Crow practices, and he was banned for a number of races. There were many death threats made against him if he raced. When he went to Savannah, as I mentioned earlier, white riders sent him a note saying, if you don't leave, we'll basically kill you. So he faced this again and again, and he would race where he could and disprove, those theories. There came a point where his manager, he was banned so frequently, his manager tried to apply a lotion to his skin to make him look relatively white. It was ineffective, but incredibly dangerous and harmful and hurtful. So after a few days, he said stop the procedure, but at that point, he decided that he would use the racism against him as motivation, and that's what he did.
So we're trying to put it in perspective. In today's world, if you're trying to make a point to the community at large, that we have social media or something of the sort. In his day, I mean, he had to depend on the newspapers. Were they cooperating? Were the newspapers telling his story
Yeah, it's a great question, and it really helped me do this book because he was written about, I call him one of the most chronicled African-American individuals of his day, which is astonishing since most people will say, I've never heard of this person. But at the time, he was one of the best-known African Americans because he was winning in the most popular sport. He was regularly in the sports pages all over, not just this country, but the world. He competed in Europe repeatedly, went to Australia 2 seasons. So he was one of the most widely chronicled athletes and also African Americans, which gave me an awful lot of insight into what happened. And he had detractors for sure in the press, especially in the South, but he had a lot of supporters in other parts of the country and especially around the world. He was a lot of writers who would write about him, with a lot of adulation, saying, this disproves what a lot of people are saying. This was a time period where for a lot of whites, they weren't interacting with blacks other than sometimes, in different ways. But this person was, a different model for the race because he was allowed to compete. In fact, he would promote these races. There's a button that I read that's published in the photo part of the book, and it says black versus white, shows Taylor versus a white racer. And they would, at some point, the promoters, the racers didn't want him often, but the promoters saw him as a drawing card because people wanted to come out, see who was this person who was beating all these white racers so badly.
You also feature people like Teddy Roosevelt and J.P. Morgan, even Booker T. Washington in the book.
Yeah, I mean, it's some people have referred to it as sort of like a ragtime, which was a novel that people see all sorts of different characters. Theodore Roosevelt was the police commissioner of New York during the six-day race he competed in, I mentioned, later became governor of New York, and said that he followed Taylor's exploits, especially as Taylor won championships in Europe, and later the two met. It was 1916 in Massachusetts, and Roosevelt told Taylor how honored he was to meet someone who had achieved the top of his profession. And there are many other individuals.
Well, that's good to know.
Yeah, I mean, there are many individuals that he meets in history. As your co-host mentioned, Booker T. Washington, the African American leader. He takes an ocean liner from Europe back to this country, and I call it the chapter "The Voyage of the Titans" because he's traveling with J.P. Morgan, Cornelius Vanderbilt, Pierre Lorillard, many famous millionaires of the day. And there's an anecdote where someone sees Cornelius Vanderbilt and Major Taylor boarding the ship, and they don't know who Vanderbilt is, but they recognize that's Major Taylor. It just shows how famous he was.
That's awesome.
Did the bicycle companies of the day jump on the bandwagon for the famous racers and just donate their bicycles, or how did that work?
They did. I mean, it's a great question. So the first person who basically was a sponsor for Major Taylor was a guy named Bertie Munger, and he had his own bicycle manufacturing company and took Major Taylor under his wing in part because he wanted Major Taylor to run races with his state-of-the-art bicycles, and Taylor did that. And later, a number of other bicycle companies actually sponsored Major Taylor. They looked past this whole issue of racism. They saw an incredible racer, and it is remarkable. This probably wouldn't have happened if it weren't for a number of bicycle companies saying, we're going to pay your way, we're going to give you bicycles, we're going to sponsor you, we're going to back you. If you look through a lot of magazines from the time period, you see these bicycle companies with a picture of Major Taylor sponsoring their bikes.
Really?
So, it was something that was very unusual. It's hard for me to think of. I'm sure there may be someone who knows the subject better, but in the 1890s and the very early 1900s, to have major companies, and they were major companies at the time, use an African American as their, the space of the company, if you will, that really was very helpful for Major Taylor in spreading the message that he wanted to send.
Were there a lot of political cartoons out then?
There were, and he was unfortunately depicted in some very racist ways.
I bet.
One of the big, interesting things is that bicycling was so big at this time that there were magazines that came out every week. They would be, 100 or more pages. And Taylor is mentioned in almost every one of them. So for me as a researcher doing this, I found a lot of sources that, I had never heard of. But the magazines, for example, I'm calling you from D.C., down the street at the Library of Congress, they have all the copies. Some are online, but a lot aren't online. So, you do some research looking up things digitized, but also you do things the way I've done it for years. And you go to a library and you spend a lot of time leafing through and looking for, what you're trying to find in the right time period. So to me, that's part of the fun of discovery.
Yeah, I love that you said that. There's so many things. We forget that there's a library sometimes. We think everything's on Google, and everything isn't always on Google. Sometimes
Most things aren't on Google.
Sometimes you can look into a great library. The book is currently #1. You're getting 5-star reviews across the board. You're getting some really good feedback from people who've read the book. Do you take us to his childhood? Do we get to know the person that he was?
Yeah, I mean, it's a full-fledged biography. So I do take you to his father having served in the Civil War for the North and being at the fall of Richmond, which is one of the things that took me a long time to track down, but I did discover and wrote about in the book and tell you about Taylor's childhood in Indianapolis and all the things he faced there and how he went to Massachusetts and then how he goes around the world and becomes one of the most traveled individuals, of the time.
What were his experiences racism-wise in other countries? Was the United States the worst of all, or were the other Western European countries kind of the same?
The United States was by far the worst. He was welcomed and adulated in other countries around the world. Yes, he experienced some racism in Europe and occasionally in Australia, but by and large, he was seen as a champion figure. I mean, they were interested in his exploits. Doesn't mean they weren't racist, because certainly there were plenty of racists all over the place. But at that point, they really appreciated his artistry and his athleticism. And you look at for example, the publications in France. He's on magazine covers. They run lots of photos. He actually, in some ways, got more publicity in France, which was the hotbed of cycling in the world, than he did in this country for a while, because he eventually had to leave this country to be able to race against the world's best because of the various racism that he did face.
Well, you did so much research on this, and then you put out this wonderful book, and still some people refuse to learn from history.
Well, I do still think it's relevant today. There's a very sad scene towards the end of the book where he's writing his autobiography. Taylor is in Worcester, Massachusetts, and there's the largest Klan rally in the history of New England is being held in the 1920s just miles from his house. It's sad to think about that after all he did, that he had to see this going on so close to where he lived. But just shortly after that, there was an even larger Klan rally here in Washington, D.C., down Pennsylvania Avenue. So I think it's important to remind people of the history. You mentioned it wasn't that long ago, and I mentioned my experience reporting actually in Florida. It is important to know our history. I feel that very strongly. It's very relevant. I do feel it helps us understand today. And what I tried to do with this book was not just write the story of this extraordinary athlete, but a story of the time. It's a social history. It's about the mixing of the Gilded Age, the Jim Crow era, the story of this, really unparalleled figure in our history of sport. And also, he really belongs in our pantheon of civil rights figures because he did pave the way. He was the first African-American sports hero, as I call him in the subtitle, before Jack Johnson, the heavyweight boxing champion, or Jesse Owens, the racer and ran in the Olympics in Berlin, or half a century before Jackie Robinson. If those three men were here today, I feel very confident they would say Major Taylor paved the way.
When he was racing in Montreal, was he racing just against black racers or mixed?
No. So in Montreal, to set the scene, he had won the national championship in various ways in this country. And then in 1899, he was invited to participate in the World Championship. A number of white racers from this country refused to participate because they didn't want to be on the same track as a black man, sad to say. A lot of other racers did go, but the best racers from around the world went there. So they were all, there may have been other blacks there, but basically the main competitors he faced were white from around the world. And this was his chance to prove himself on the national stage. When he competed in the United States, he was often, when he won a race, sometimes the band would taunt him by playing Dixie, the unofficial anthem of the Confederacy. Oh. When he went to Montreal, competed in the World Championships, and then he won the World Championship in Montreal, a great moment in his life, 1899. So again, long before others had done that, as far as African-American sports, legends. He stood up, and they played for him the Star-Spangled Banner. And it was the first time he'd had that played for him, and he said, I had never felt more American than when the Star-Spangled Banner was played for me in Canada. So that really underscores what he had to experience. It's an extraordinary moment.
I have a question about, let's see, I'll use the Emperor's New Clothing as a way to set the question up. Did the young kids who were in awe of him see through it, like in the Emperor's New Clothes, how that young kid sees right through it? Like, were the white kids did they not care about race? Did they just say, "Oh my gosh, this guy is great"? Because sometimes it's the kids who really change society, right?
Well, Major Taylor, it's hard for me to say what the young kids at the time felt because I don't have a written record, but I certainly have many written records of what white journalists and other white racers said and so forth. And there were plenty who admired him greatly, and there were others who were incredibly racist. So that he certainly experienced plenty of both. He wanted his message to be, however, to young people. So to go to your point, he said, no one can defeat Father Time, but he wanted to be remembered for if you are given a fair chance, equal footing to begin a race or to be in any field, as he put it, of human endeavor, then you can succeed if you apply yourself. So he wanted his message to be given a fair chance that he would work hard enough, he could persevere against the greatest adversity. And that's what he did, and that's what he hoped his legacy would be, particularly to young people.
Can you help me understand the dynamics of the sport itself, especially at that time? Was it considered a team sport, or was it an individual sport?
Well, it was both. Yeah, it was both.
So did he share locker rooms with the other guys?
He did. So sometimes you would compete against the clock. So you'd go one against the clock. He did that and won, set world records time and again. Sometimes you will. He did not team up with people in the sense that, there were some cases where it was essence like a relay race, if you will. But by and large, he was an individual competitor. Sometimes there would be this unofficial efforts to sort of compete, to collude together, frankly. Several riders would get together and say, you help me, I'll help you, and you win this race. But he didn't want to do that because, for the most part, the other racers didn't want to work with him. So he just basically didn't do that. That made it harder for him.
My gosh.
But he took pride in the fact that he didn't do that. Other racers, however, could easily try to gang up on him. If you can envision a track in which the racers are in a pack and you're sort of in the middle, you are in what they called the pocket. It'd be very hard. They could trap you and you couldn't escape. He worked to perfect a technique that enabled him to escape these pockets time and again. It was very dangerous. 11 of his competitors, he wrote later, were killed on the track in various racing accidents. It was a very, very dangerous sport. For example, I mentioned before Jack Johnson, the world heavyweight boxing champion in 1908. Well, Jack Johnson first wanted to be a cyclist and emulate Major Taylor. He competed in races, and one day in Texas, he was seriously injured on the track. He was hospitalized, and he later said, that was when I decided that I needed to compete in a less dangerous profession than cycling, so he became a boxer.
Wow.
So it shows you how incredibly dangerous. Isn't that incredible?
Yeah, really. Oh, my gosh.
The sport was.
Wow.
Yeah.
What role did religion or spirituality play in his life?
Well, a big role. He promised his mother that he would adhere to his Baptist faith, and he pledged that he would not race on Sundays, and he kept to that for most of his career. As a result, he lost tens of thousands of dollars in potential winnings. For 2 years, promoters from France tried to bring him over there, and he refused because they had insisted on him racing on Sundays. Eventually, they wanted him so badly, they said there was no other racer they wanted more than Major Taylor, that they agreed to pay him $10,000, and he wouldn't have to race on Sundays, plus he could keep his winnings. So this meant an awful lot to him. He didn't try to impose his religion on others, but he made clear his faith, and he felt that God was watching out for him, as he said.
Wow. Have you had any movie makers or TV people come to you and ask to do the story?
People have been talking about that for years and years, so I hope that happens one day, but we'll see.
Well, my only comment about it, I hope somebody treats it in the right way. I hope somebody treats it the same way you've treated the story,
Thank you. Well, that would be great.
Okay, wow. I loved this conversation. I want to recommend go to Amazon to get the book. Again, it is called The World's Fastest Man, Michael Kranish. Am I saying your last name right, Michael?
Yes, that's right.
Kranish. Do you have a website?
ISH. Kranish. MichaelKranish.com.
Oh, Kranish. I'm sorry.
Right.
Okay. So can we get the book on your site?
There's a link to Amazon. I don't sell it directly. It's like any book today. It came out 3 weeks ago and from Scribner, and it's available at Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and other bookstores.
I appreciate your insight on a lot of things that are still part of our world today. I'm from Long Island, and it amazed me to learn long after I was an adult that some of those bridges on Long Island were actually put up lower than the buses to keep the black communities from this inner city from getting out to the beaches. I don't know if you ever heard those stories, but...
No.
Michael, thank you. Thank you for being on the show with us today.
Thanks for having me very much. Appreciate it.
All right, we'll be right back.